Well, I want to welcome you to the second module. And now that you know something about the spinal cord and brainstem, we're going to have about 7 lectures on the motor systems. And this is very difficult material. So Dave and I are spending quite a bit of time putting together a tape for you. We're going to start in this motor system series with the lower motor neuron, because it does all the work, as you know. Then we're going to move up to central pattern generators and some brainstem pathways like the rubrospinal that you know. We'll go up to motor cortex, which does a lot of work, and premotor, which does a lot of planning. And then we'll do some examination of the basal ganglia, which will be the hardest part of the course, and then finish up with cerebellum. So here we go. The best place to start, like I said, is in the ventral horn, and we know these ventral horn neurons, these lower motor neurons in the spinal cord, are doing all the work. They're kind of like the grunts or the ditch diggers, because as you know from the first module, lower motor neurons send their axons out the ventral horn and go out to the muscle and do all the work. And what we want you to know is that there's an organization to the ventral horn. The best way I can usually remember it is if I just kind of put my arms out, straight out to the side, and kind of like, you know, if you're trying to flex in like a Atlas, or remember the guy George Atlas, who the weightlifter. So you're just kind of standing there showing your muscles best you can. And I always remember from this that the lower motor neurons that are outmost lateral are going to go out to the distal, like my hand muscles. The lower motor neurons that are most medial in the ventral horn are for axial and proximal muscles. Then the neurons that are more dorsal, if you just keep that flex position, the lower motor neurons that are more dorsal are going to innervate your flexors, and those that are more ventral or underneath are going to innervate your extensors. So just keep that rule in mind, and remember that the spinal cord is organized such that, you know, the cervical cord innervates the upper limb and all the muscles, and the distal muscles like your interosseous muscles. And lumbar cord is going to innervate the lower limb, so you're going to have the distal muscles there being the feet, the toes, things like that. The most important reflex that we know is the stretch reflex. And you've had this in physiology, but let's go over it a little bit. You know that in the big extrafusal muscle fibers here, like the biceps and the triceps, there are many muscle spindles, and these muscle spindles have both bag and chain intrafusal muscle fibers. So these would be extrafusal muscles, these would be intrafusal. And these intrafusal muscle fibers will be mixed among these extrafusal muscle fibers. Now you know from physiology and from the first part of the course that the 1A fiber right here would go to both the bag and the chain. So it would be conveying information into the ventral horn about the length, the constant length of the muscle from the chain, and about changes in length with the velocity, and that would be coming in from the bag. And you can see this 1A fiber is going to come in here and go directly down to the lower motor neuron. So this would be a monosynaptic reflex. That is, stretch, the 1A picks up the stretch, comes in, goes down to the lower motor neuron, one synapse. Once you've stretched this biceps, you're going to send that 1A in, going to fire that lower motor neuron. It's going to go out this alpha motor neuron and cause contraction of the biceps. Now we would call this autogenic excitation because the receptors are out here in the biceps. The information comes in and excites the lower motor neuron, which in turn goes right out there and causes contraction of the muscle from which the information came. That is, excites the muscle in which the receptors lie. So that would be called autogenic excitation. Now, we can't forget that at the same time, once this information comes in from the muscle spindles, going to drive this lower motor neuron monosynaptically, it's going to go out to the biceps, but it's also at the same time in these lower motor neurons, it's going to turn on lower motor neurons that also are going to contract synergistic muscles. So we can't forget that. So it's not just the muscle from which the receptor started, but also muscles that are synergistic to the biceps. Now, we also have something called reciprocal innervation here. That is, when we stretch the biceps, we're going to contract it. but we also want to, at the same time that we're contracting the biceps, we want to inhibit the triceps. So here comes the 1A in. It's going to monosynaptically drive that lower motor neuron that goes out here to the biceps, but it's also going to come down into a little interneuron here, which is an inhibitory interneuron. So we would call this a 1A inhibitory interneuron. Now that inhibitory interneuron will therefore then go and inhibit that lower motor neuron that is going out to the triceps. Okay, so keep in mind autogenic excitation right here, which would be that if you stretch the biceps, you are then going to contract the biceps. That's autogenic excitation. And don't forget, at the same time, you're going to want to use this little inhibitory, 1A inhibitory interneuron here to inhibit the lower motor neurons that go out to the triceps. And we call this excitation of one muscle and inhibition of the other, reciprocal innervation. Now we can control the bag and the chain. And you've also probably heard this in physiology, but some of the descending control, especially from motor cortex, coming down with the cortical spinal tract, you know that the cortical spinal tract can fire these lower motor neurons and contract the muscle. Okay? So this would be a monosynaptic reflex, corticospinal to the alpha motor neuron, and then out to the extrafusal muscle fiber. But at the same time, this descending cortical influence comes down here on these little gamma efferents. They also go out the ventral horn. But instead of going to the extrafusal muscle, they go to the intrafusal muscle fibers, to the bag and chain. And you can see there's a little gamma efferent here going out to the bag, which we call the gamma dynamic. And this little gamma efferent can put tension on the polar ends of the bag and kind of stretch it. And if you put tension and stress, stretch these areas right here, you're going to actually stretch this 1A fiber and cause some 1A firing to come in. The same thing with a gamma static. It goes out to the chain and puts tension on these polar ends. So it's kind of like faking out this chain in this bag to think that the extrafusal muscle is actually being stretched. So what they found was then motor cortex could send information down to this alpha motor neuron. And then what would happen is this big extrafusal muscle fiber would start to contract. Well, when that contraction happens, it takes the tension off the chain and bag fibers, and you wouldn't have this information coming into the brain. And remember that this 1A and 2 type information is not only coming in here and working with a stretch reflex, but it's always coming in, also coming in here and going up Clark's column to the cerebellum. Now, the nervous system doesn't want to lose this kind of information. So what happens is that when some information comes down the cortical spinal tract, it tells the alpha motor neuron to go out there and contract that extrafusal muscle fiber, but it also at the same time tells these gamma efferents to fire. And what happens is that these bags and chains keep tension. They maintain their tension so that there's a continuous firing of the 1A and 2 coming into this lower motor neuron and going up, dorsal spinal cerebellar tract. And we call this alpha gamma coactivation. So the cortical spinal will coactivate. They'll turn on this alpha motor neuron. This will start to contract. At the same time, it'll tell these gamma efferents to kind of put tension and contract these bag and chains, so you always have information coming in over the 1As and the 2s. The other type of information coming into this lower motor neuron here is from a 1B fiber, from a Golgi tendon organ out here in the tendon. And muscle, for instance, when this quadriceps contracts and puts a lot of force or tension on this Golgi tendon organ, it'll start firing. This 1B will come in and go down, not directly to the lower motor neuron, like the 1As and the 2s, but to this little inhibitory interneuron, which we call a 1B inhibitory interneuron. So here comes a 1B fiber. When there's a big increase in tension down here, it's going to come in, go right down into this ventral horn and tell this 1B inhibitory interneuron to fire. This inhibitory interneuron will then go and inhibit the actual muscle from which the tension information is coming from. And we call this autogenic inhibition. So here we have a 1B inhibitory interneuron. Now remember, this is not a direct monosynaptic reflex here because you have an excitatory input being changed here, turning on an inhibitory input. So when there's too much tension on the quadriceps during contraction, this information can come in and autogenically inhibit the muscle. Now this slide shows the flexor reflex over on this side. And what happens here is that in the flexion reflex, if you step on a noxious stimulus like a tack, it's going to come in over a C or D fiber. It's going to ascend a little bit, but let's just bring it into the dorsal horn. So here's this painful information. And it's going to send this dorsal horn cell is going to send this information down into the ventral horn so that you can basically turn on your hamstrings to lift your foot and inhibit your quadriceps. All right? Now, while you're lifting this foot with your hamstrings, you're also going to want to stabilize the other leg. In this particular case, you're going to turn on your quadriceps and inhibit your hamstrings. So this would be the flexor reflex over on this side, and this would be the cross extension reflex over here. So here you're going to turn on the hammies and inhibit the quads. On the opposite side, you're going to inhibit the hammies and turn on the quads. Now, if we look at down in the ventral horn at a slightly higher power, you can see this. Here comes the painful information in like this. And let's just look for some excitatory. Here's a little excitatory input right here, an excitatory interneuron that's going to go and fire those lower motor neurons that are going to go out to your flexors. At the same time, that same information is going to come in here and go to an inhibitory interneuron that's going to go and inhibit your extensors. If we look at the other side, you can see here comes the fiber in. It's going to go to this particular process right here, inhibitory interneuron that's going to go out the other side. So this lower motor neuron here is going to inhibit the hamstrings, and this one right here is going to excite the extensors. Now, from this brief review of reflexes, you might think that they're hardwired and totally non-adaptable, but as you can see up here in the label, reflexes are highly adaptable. And what has been found is that the transmission in reflex pathways is kind of set according to the motor task that you're going to do. So in this particular case, the motor task is to stabilize the body so that when there's a little perturbation here, a little stretch of this wrist muscle here, if you pull this way, you stretch these muscles, of course you're going to get a little contraction in the wrist muscles, but you can see also that you're going to get a reflex response all the way over here on the opposite arm into these extensors of the elbow. And if the task is to stabilize the body, you're going to activate these extensors of the elbow. However, if the task is don't spill the body, again we're going to have our little stretch here of the wrist muscles. And again we're going to have a reflex, something happen on the other side, but in this particular case we're going to inhibit the extensors of the elbow because the task is don't spill the coffee. So the point of this slide is that you should realize that the reflexes are adaptable. They're set based upon the motor task that the brain or you want to carry out, and that a little stimulus here from a localized area can give responses in muscles very far away, and that descending input, especially from the cortex, plays an important role in modulating and adapting these spinal reflexes. Now, in addition to the wiring for the spinal reflexes, we also have in the spinal cord neuronal networks that generate rhythmic alternating activity in the flexor and extensor muscles. So this is circuitry within the spinal cord that can generate these rhythmic alternating movements. Now, as shown on a diagram here, the flexors and the extensors are controlled by two systems of neurons, which we have termed half centers. So this circuitry here would be in one ventral horn. This would be in one ventral horn, and there are what we call two half centers. But again, I think there's been some confusion. This is all in one ventral horn. One half center is going to be involved in firing the flexor motor neurons for flexion, and in turn turning on an inhibitory interneuron that will inhibit the extensor motor neurons. So this would be one half center right here. And then there's another half center which has neurons that are going to help fire the extensor motor neuron, but in turn inhibit the flexor motor neuron. So we have two half centers here. And you can see that we've labeled tonic descending input into both of these half centers. We're not quite sure what gives one of these half centers an advantage. In addition to this tonic descending input that's coming down at the same time, there are also some sensory inputs down into these half centers. So basically, one of these half centers gets an advantage. Let's say it's the flexor right here. This gets an advantage, and of course, this interneuron here is going out and fire that flexor motor neuron. You're going to have flexion of the leg. At the same time, it's going to go in here and turn on this inhibitory interneuron, which is going to inhibit those extensors because you don't want to have co-contraction. At the same time, just a little bit later, this inhibitory interneuron will in fact turn itself off. And now, since there's been this tonic descending input going down here the entire time, now the extensor excitatory neuron turns on, and you get this extensor motor neuron firing. At the same time, it's going to go back and turn on its inhibitory interneuron, which makes sure that those flexors don't fire. But again, then this is going to turn itself off. So we have an alternating rhythmic flexion, extension, flexion, extension. The key here is that you don't, as you're walking down the street going down State Street, your motor cortex isn't saying to your legs, extend, flex, extend, flex. Basically, it can kind of turn that over to these central pattern generators. Now also realize that in a patient with a complete transection of the cord, if somehow probably via a stimulus, a sensory stimulus that comes in here, a quadriplegic can, once the sensory stimulus gets in here and turns on one of these central pattern generators, you get flexion, extension, flexion, extension. So you can see that these central pattern generators can work below the level of a complete transection of the spinal cord if in fact somehow they're turned on. Now that we talked about the lower motor neurons and the reflexes and the central pattern generators, let's talk about some of the pathways in the brainstem that descend and influence these reflexes and lower motor neurons. Now we know from the first module about the lateral cortical spinal tract, it travels in the lateral funiculus and tends to terminate upon lower motor neurons out here more laterally in the ventral horn. And it's these lower motor neurons that innervate more distal musculature. Traveling right next to it and coming out of the contralateral ruber would be the rubrospinal tract. Again, it's in the lateral funiculus, traveling quite close to the lateral cortical spinal tract, and like the lateral cortical spinal tract, tends to terminate on these lower motor neurons out here more peripherally or laterally in the ventral horn, those that go out and innervate distal musculature. Now, in the spinal cord, we can call this the dorsal lateral system. Some people also call it the lateral system. And this system would be made up, again, of the lateral cortical spinal tract, rubrospinal tract, and they work more on these lower motor neurons that innervate distal musculature. When we turn down to the ventral funiculus in here, we have some that we already know, the tectospinal and medial vestibulospinal tracts. Now you can see here we've labeled this T1, so this is just about as far as the medial vestibulospinal tract and tectospinal tracts would go. They focus primarily in the cervical region. Then we have our old friend, the lateral vestibulospinal tract here, which we know is coming down from the vestibular nuclei the same side. Tectospinal would be coming from the superior colliculus to the opposite side. And the medial vestibulospinal tract, is both crossed and uncrossed, but primarily uncrossed, coming from the vestibular nuclei. We have two new players here. We have what we call the medullary reticulospinal tract and the Pontine reticulospinal tract. What these all have in common is that they travel in this ventral funiculus. and they tend to terminate more medially in the ventral horn. Now remember, the lateral cortical spinal tract and rubra were out here laterally for the distal musculature, ventral horn cells innervating distal musculature. These pathways that are traveling in the ventral funiculus are going to terminate more medially in the ventral horn. Therefore, they're going to innervate or be concerned primarily with lower motor neurons that innervate axial and more proximal musculature. Now this ventral medial system down here, you can see it in this next figure. We can see that some of the fibers in the ventral medial system are coming from the superior colliculus. Some are coming from the Pontine reticular formation. We call these the Pontine Reticulospinal tracts. Some are coming from the vestibular nuclei, and some are coming from the Medullary reticular formation. Now this reticular formation, these are just areas of the brainstem that we haven't talked about in our earlier series. Now you can see all these are feeding into the ventral medial system, which is going to be concerned with controlling those lower motor neurons that are more involved in controlling axial and proximal musculature. Now here again is another diagram showing the cortical spinal tract, and you know it's going to run in the lateral funiculus. Here's the rubral spinal tract, which also runs in the lateral funiculus and kind of works together to control these lower motor neurons that are more laterally placed in the ventral horn and therefore innervate more distal musculature. Now we can think about what would result from lesions of these dorsal, lateral, or ventral medial systems. Lesions in the ventral medial system are going to give you problems with your axial and more proximal musculature. You're going to have trouble getting out of a chair. Things like that, but your distal musculature is going to be in pretty good shape. On the other hand, if you have lesions of the lateral cortical spinal tract and the rubrospinal tract out here in this dorsal lateral descending system, you're going to be able to stand all right, and your posture is going to be okay, but you're going to have trouble with your controlling the more distal musculature. Now we can move up to cortex. As you know, we've taken care of the lower motor neurons and the central pattern generators and the brainstem pathways, the ventral medial and dorsal lateral pathways. Now we move up to motor cortex. Here you can see the representation of the cortex. This would be rostral, this would be caudal, and we can see the lateral surface of the hemisphere here. Here would be the temporal lobe here, frontal lobe, occipital lobe. And in this little sketch here, you can actually see the medial wall of the left side of the hemisphere. So this is rostral, caudal, this is all lateral. This would be the medial wall. And we can see two nice gyri here. This would be a precentral gyrus, or area 4, or motor cortex. And the one behind it is the postcentral gyrus. We also call this areas 3, 1, and 2, or S1. This is where the pathways that are coming up from the thalamus, thalamic nuclei like VPL and VPM are coming up here, bringing up 2-point discrimination, pain and temperature, things like that. So this is where those thalamic nuclei target. So this we call somatosensory 1, this we call motor 1. Frontal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe. In particular, we're talking about the primary motor cortex right here. This is Brodmann's area 4. And we've taken a cross-section over here. So this would be the most lateral part, so we'd be looking out in here. This medial part would be on the medial wall, which we really can't see the medial wall of the right hemisphere. We can see the medial wall of the left hemisphere. You can see there's a somatotopic representation of the primary motor cortex here, large representation of the face and of the lips. You can see the tongue down here, large representation of the thumb. Then things start to get smaller, and you can see that the leg actually hangs over the medial wall. So the leg and toes are over on the medial wall of the hemisphere, so they're going to get a blood supply from the anterior cerebral artery, and the rest of the body is out here getting its supply primarily from the middle cerebral artery. Now, you know, coming out of the primary motor cortex here is the most famous pathway in the world, the cortical spinal tract. And thus far in the course, we've traced these fibers down the cerebral peduncle, down to the pyramid here at level 3, and then they cross and comprise the lateral cortical spinal tract. Now, another name for these cortical spinal axons are pyramidal tract cells. So these are called corticospinal neurons or pyramidal tract neurons. The reason that we also call these pyramidal tract neurons is because these axons travel through the pyramids. So you can recall that any lesion above the decussation is going to give you a contralateral problem. And then once we get into the spinal cord, it's going to be an ipsilateral problem. But these are pyramidal tract neurons up in here, and investigators have recorded from these pyramidal tract neurons. And here you can see the monkey, and you can see that actually we're recording from a primary motor cortex, or M1, and you can see that the monkey is asked to either flex or extend its wrist. And at the same time we're recording, now if this is his left arm, or the monkey, recording in the right primary motor cortex, especially in the wrist area of the primary motor cortex. And then they can see what happens when this animal either flexes or extends its wrist. They can record from certain neurons up here in primary motor cortex. And this shows you several things here. Here are the action potentials. Each one of these little spikes here would be the action potentials of those pyramidal tract neurons that they're recording from. This would be the EMG activity in the muscles that are either flexing or extending that lever, and this is the actual lever movement. And you can see that the first thing that happens is that the pyramidal tract neuron fires, then the muscle begins to fire, and then the lever movement actually begins to fire. So this is a recording from a pyramidal tract cell or a cortical spinal neuron in the primary motor cortex. And you can see again that the firing of this cell precedes the EMG and the lever movement. Now, you can see that this timing is very important. Again, notice the timing, the PTN, the EMG, and the lever movement. Now, the monkey will just keep flexing. Say, for instance, if the animal is being rewarded for flexing, and we're recording here from a flexor neuron up there in primary motor cortex. Now, if the animal's flexing, only a flexor cell up in the primary motor cortex is going to fire. That extensor neuron will not fire. So we've got a cell here that every time, for instance, we ask the animal to flex, it fires, it precedes the EMG and the actual flexion movement. This cell will just keep firing. It never habituates. You can ask this monkey to just flex continuously, and this cell will never habituate. It fires every time that animal flexes. Now, the other thing about this pyramidal tract neuron is very interested in coding how much force is in that flexion. Again, the direction, right, because we know that it's flexing, and how fast that the flexion actually occurs. Okay, so this pyramidal tract neuron is very interested in the force. It'll fire a little differently. If you increase the force, it'll fire a little bit more. The direction, we know it's very specific because this cell is only firing when you flex. And velocity, if you speed up the flexion, this will fire a little faster too. So it's not as though this cortical spinal tract neuron is sending that information down to the lower motor neuron and just saying, hey, take care of such basics as force, direction, or velocity. It's actually telling the lower motor neuron information about force, direction, and velocity. And as we see right here, this is actually pretty basic information. So the primary motor cortex is actually pretty close to the spinal cord. Well, that makes sense. It's telling the spinal cord what to do. But it just doesn't sit up there and tell the spinal cord to do all the dirty work. It actually is involved in coding the force, direction, and velocity. Now, why the primary motor cortex is sending down those cortical spinal fibers to tell those lower motor neurons information about force and direction and velocity. We have other areas of the cortex, which I call a little bit more highfalutin. They're more involved in the planning of the movement. So such areas as the supplementary motor area or the lateral premotor area here, they lie rostral. So here's the primary motor cortex. They lie rostral to the primary motor cortex, and this whole area we call area 6. So the supplementary motor cortex, or we also call SMA, and the lateral premotor cortex are both called area 6, but they have different names and they have different functions. Now recall, here's the primary motor cortex, here's the primary somatosensory cortex here, so this would be area 4, area 3, 1, and 2. So if we go 3, 1, and 2, 4, up in here is area 6. All of it is area 6. Even some on the medial wall here. Remember, we had some primary motor cortex on the medial wall. That is the leg representation. We have some somatosensory S1 representation here on the medial wall. This is also the leg representation. Now, if we move forward of this leg representation in motor 1, we come to what we call the supplementary motor area right here on the medial wall. You can also see it some on the lateral wall, and the lateral premotor is the rest of area 6. So all this is area 6, here, here, and here. And it's been found that the lateral premotor area and the supplementary motor area differ a little bit in their functions, but both of them are involved in planning. We call them premotor because both of them feed into the primary motor cortex, which then has access to those large cells called the Bet cells and other cortical spinal neurons, which are going to go down and actually tell the lower motor neurons what to do. So here's primary motor cortex. This I call premotor, and these areas are involved in planning. This area is involved in execution. So these planning areas right here are feeding into the primary motor cortex, turning on those cortical spinal neurons. Now again, there's slightly different functions of the supplementary motor area and the lateral premotor area. Now, when we talk about this region right in here, again, here's the primary motor cortex, area 4. Here's the primary somatosensory cortex, or areas 3, 1, and 2. This whole area now is area 6. So don't forget, some of this is on the medial wall, okay? And some of this is on the lateral wall. This would be the supplementary motor area. This would be the lateral premotor area right here. Now, in the case of the lateral premotor area, we know that this area is involved in planning, and it uses what we call external cues for the selection of the appropriate action. So this area knows the appropriate action to carry out, but it uses an external cue, like an apple to reach for, or even an auditory cue to make a particular movement. Now, if we see an apple out there and we want to reach for it, we know that it's going to fall on the retina. And all the information on the retina is going to do is kind of tell you in retinal coordinates where that apple is out in your visual field. It's going to come back to something called the lateral genicular nucleus, give that information to the lateral geniculate, which is in the thalamus. And then we're going to go into area 17, which is the primary visual area, primary visual cortex. Still, we just kind of know where that apple is in retinal coordinates. Then from the primary visual cortex, it's going to go to what we call posterior parietal cortex, where some sensory, that is, where out here is the stimulus, the apple, motor, that is, sensory motor transformation is going to take place so you can actually reach out and grab that apple. And this is a very important place here, posterior parietal cortex, where it takes the representation of this visual stimulus in extrapersonal space and does some transformations on it so it can then, so that we can eventually reach out and grab that apple. Well, it does some transformations and then it sends it over here to the premotor area, the lateral premotor area. So this lateral premotor area says uses external cues for the selection of the appropriate action. That is to reach out for the apple. Well, once you're in the lateral premotor area, then you just feed right back into the primary motor cortex, which is going to do all the work by going down there via the cortical spinal tract and telling those lateral lower motor neurons what to do. So for instance, they can train monkeys to touch lit panels in a proper sequence. So you might have 3 panels out in front of you and they light up 1, 2, 3, and the monkey or the human can touch the panel in the proper sequence. Well, they can learn how to do this, okay? And then the experimental can turn on those panels in a particular sequence, and the human or monkey will touch them in the proper sequence. Even though it learned it earlier, but it's still using an external cue to touch the lit panels. So when the first panel lights up, it touches it. The second one lights up, it uses an external cue to touch it. And the third one lights up and it touches it. So PML uses external cues for the selection of appropriate actions. Now what happens when we have lesions of the lateral premotor area? The most common finding is apraxia. Now apraxia is a very important thing for you to understand in this course. It's a problem in carrying out a coordinated motor action without any paralysis or sensory disturbance. So in other words, your cortical spinal tract is fine, your sensory pathways are fine, but you just can't do the motor act. You have no paralysis, you have no problem with sensory information. Now, it shows here that even though you can respond to a visual cue, so there might be a cue, for instance, like to light, that first panel might light up, and then the second, then the third. Even though you can still see the visual cues, you cannot integrate it into a very fine, coordinated motor movement. So that's an apraxia. No paralysis, no weakness, no problems with the sensory information. You just can't transform that sensory information into a coordinated movement. Now let's talk about the other premotor area, the supplementary motor area. You can see it's on the lateral hemisphere, and it actually goes over onto the medial wall of the medial hemisphere. So in contrast to the lateral premotor, it's just out here. The supplementary motor area is a little bit bigger, but remember, both of them are in area 6. Now in contrast to the lateral premotor area, which uses external cues, the SMA, or the supplementary motor area, uses internal cues for the selection of the appropriate targets. And when I use the term internal cues, I'm thinking about memory. In other words, if a monkey or a human is taught to touch those 3 panels in a particular sequence, all right? After they're taught to touch the 3 panels in a particular sequence, there'll be a lapse of time, and then they'll be asked to touch them again in that particular sequence. And people with SMA lesions could not do that. Or on the other hand, if you're recording from a monkey in SMA, when they're given the cue to point to those panels in the appropriate sequence, cells light up in the supplementary motor area. So the take home is that the lateral premotor area uses external cues for the selection of an appropriate action, and the SMA uses internal cues or memory. So lesions of the SMA again are going to give you apraxia. In the course book we talk a little bit about the fact that SMA usually lights up on both sides, even though you're only going to be using one arm or one leg. So usually you have an involvement of SMA in bimanual coordination. That is, both sides are going to light up, but only one motor cortex is going to fire. The other interesting thing is that the sequencing of movements is lost. For example, if you're going to make a movement that involves 1 or 2 or 3 sequences in a row, lesions of SMA affect the ability to carry out the sequencing of those. Now, this slide shows some of the results from studies of regional cerebral blood flow. That is, they're looking at different cortical areas that light up when we do different motor actions. And simple compression of a spring here repeatedly, what lights up is the contralateral finger area of M1. Nothing's lighting up in either SMA or the lateral premotor area. So this is just all M1 in the finger area on the contra side, lighting up every time you compress this spring. Also, right behind M1 is S1, postcentral gyrus, and these cells are also lighting up, showing an increased blood flow because every time you do this, you're sending sensory information, touch and joint information and stuff like that, up those famous pathways that you learned in the brainstem up to S1. Now, if you do something a little more complicated like this movement, you're going to have, again, since you're moving your fingers, you're going to have cells firing in the contralateral M1, and again, since you're getting some sensory information going up when you do that movement, you're going to have cells firing in contralateral S1, but you're going to also have firing in the bilaterally in the supplementary motor area. Interestingly, if you just think about doing this movement, it lights up bilaterally in the SMA. Now, this is probably one of the most important slides that you're ever going to see in this course, and I would know this cold. It shows the lateral hemisphere here, so this would be the rostral, caudal. Here's your temporal lobe, here's your lateral fissure. Here's the medial hemisphere. Again, this is rostral, caudal, here's your temporal lobe. And what it shows is, it shows the middle cerebral artery distribution, like this. And what you should get out of it is that the middle cerebral artery is going to all of the premotor area, the lateral premotor area, which would be right in here. It's going to a large portion of area 4, especially that area that would be involved in the lips, and the face, and the thumb. And it's also going to the postcentral gyrus in that same representation, okay? Now, when you get up here a little more medially, you're going to get some SMA. It might get a little SMA in here, but remember, there's some SMA on the medial wall, and all of that SMA on the medial wall is supplied by the anterior cerebral. Also, the anterior cerebral is going to get that part of M1 and S1 that has the representation of the leg. So remember what's mapped here, representation of the leg in both S1 and M1. And remember, the SMA is sitting right here on the medial wall. So that anterior cerebral is going to get in here. Here's your middle cerebral. This is really important to